Hello, and in this tutorial I will teach you everything you need to know about Svelte components. At first we'll cover a basic component. After that we'll look into a component that takes in an input. Next we'll look into a component that uses two-way data binding to sync the data between the child and parent components. Next we'll look into a component that has available events that we can listen to. These events are triggered inside the component but can be listened to in the parent component. And after that, we'll cover how styles work in components and how conflicting styles are resolved in Svelte. Comment if you have any feedback, and with that out of the way, let's get into the code. Before we get into the project, all you need to have is Node.js installed and some basic knowledge of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Check out the GitHub link in the description for the full source code. Once you have a new folder open in Visual Studio Code, open the terminal and type in npm init svelte. Now create the project in our directory, choose the skeleton project, and then choose the TypeScript syntax. Next, run npm install to install all the packages. Once you've installed all the packages, close the terminal. Now open the source directory and create a new folder called lib. This folder will contain all of the components that we'll create together. In the lib folder, create a new folder called basic. Inside of that folder, create a new file called basiccomponent.svelte. In the basic component, add a header with basic text and a paragraph with some basic text as well. Now close the file and open up the pluspage.svelte file in the routes folder. Remove all the default markdown that Svelte has provided us with and create a new script tag that we'll use to import the different components. SvelteKit allows us to access any file within the lib directory and any other file using the $lib convention. So import the basic component, initialize it in the markdown like so. Now open the terminal and run the command npm run dev. Once the dev server is up and running, click the link to localhost. Once you have the dev server open, you can see that there's a header and a paragraph under the header. Now go back to Visual Studio Code and in the lib folder create a new folder called input. In this folder create a new file called inputcomponent.svelte. Once you have the file open, create a new script tag with the lang property set to ts. This will enable TypeScript for this file. In Svelte, when you want to take any properties in a component, you would first have to use the export let followed by the name, and if you have a TypeScript file, then you could follow it by the type of input that you want. For now, let's simply have an export let input that is of type string. Now just add the header and the paragraph. In Svelte, when you want to use a specific variable in the markdown, you would have to add the curly braces followed by the name of the input like so. Now close the file. Now open up the pluspage.svelte file in the routes folder. Comment out the basic component and import the input component from the lib folder. In the HTML, add the input component. For the input property, we'll just put some random text. If you go to the dev server, you can see that there's a header and a paragraph. And you can see that the input property that we use for the input component is inside the paragraph. Let's go back to VS Code. Now create a new variable called input, which is some dummy text, and assign the input property on the input component to the variable. As you can see in the HTML, Svelte has some weird syntax that if the variable is the same name as the property, you could simply add the curly braces and Svelte will know which input to apply it to. As you can see, both input components have the input property that is set as the input variable, but one of them looks more cleaner than the next one. They effectively do the same thing, but it's just a simple quality of life change that Svelte has done for us. Create a new input element, and as you can see in Svelte, we have this special notation called bind::value is equal to input. What this does is that it maintains the same value in the input as the variable. So if the variable changes, so will the value of the input, and if the value of the input changes, so will the variable. Now open up the dev server once again, and as you can see, if we type into the text box, you can see that the input changes in the input component, and the paragraph changes as a result. Now go back to VS Code and comment out the input component. Close the file and create a new folder in the lib folder called bind. Inside of this folder, create a new file called bindComponent.svelte. Once you have the file open, create a new script tag with the lang property set to ts. Create a new property called input create a new function called clear input, and in the HTML add a header, a paragraph, and a div that contains a label that is connected to an input and a button. For the input, we're just going to use it as a binding for the input variable, and the button will be used to bind it to the clear input function. So whenever the user clicks the button, it clears the input. Now close the file. Now open the pluspage.svelte file in the routes folder. Once you have the file open, import the bind component and use it in the HTML. Bind the input to it using the bind::input syntax from Svelte. As we've seen throughout the video, Svelte has allowed us to cut down on the amount of code by having some quality of life changes that are usually not present in other frameworks. Under the bind component, create a new section that contains an input that is binded to the input variable on the top level. Also give it its own label. And once you're done creating all the HTML, go over to the dev server. Once you have the dev server open, you can see that there are two inputs and a button that says clear input. If you type into one of the two inputs, it changes the value on the other one. And everything is interconnected, so the paragraph also is synced up to the same value. As you can see, if we press clear input, all of the paragraph and the inputs get synced up to the same value. Once you're back into VS Code, comment out all the HTML that is associated with the bind component. Afterwards, close the file. In the lib folder, create a new folder called event. Inside of that folder, create a new file called eventComponent.svelte. Now once you have the file open, create a new script tag with the context of module and the language of TypeScript. Now let's pause for a minute. In Svelte, you can create a module script on every single component you can think of. It can be a Svelte kit file, it could be a normal Svelte component, it could be whatever you want. Every Svelte component can have a module script. And just to take note, the module script only runs once, and it only runs when the module for the script is loaded. That being said, the module script can be used to create variables that are publicly known to the whole SvelteKit project. This is especially useful for libraries because they can create interfaces and types on their SvelteKit file, and they can export it directly from their SvelteKit file. And last but not least, all of the variables declared in the module script are readily available in the normal script. So let's see how it plays out in the event component. Create a new interface called component events. This will contain the name of the event and the data type of the event. Now create a new script tag with the lang property set to TS. Import the create event dispatcher function from Svelte and call the create event dispatcher function and assign it to the dispatch event variable. The create event dispatcher function allows us to call custom events on our Svelte components. Because we gave it a generic type, we already know what are the possible events and what are their event data types. So create a new variable called event value and create a reactive statement which calls the dispatch event every time the input value changes. Under that, create a new function called handle reset which dispatches the event called reset and has the input value set to an empty string. Now in the HTML, add a header. Under that, create an input that binds to the input value variable. Under that, create a variable that's on click function is handled by the handle reset function. Now close the file and open up the pluspage.svelte file in the routes folder. Once you have the file open, import the event component from the lib folder and import the fade function from svelte/transition. In the HTML, use the event component. Now every time the text input event goes off, we set the input to the event.detail. Now simply create a new section that contains the input and go over to the dev server. As you can see, every time you type into the text box, it syncs up to the parent component. Now let's go back to VS Code and create a new variable called show reset message and set it to false. Under the markdown we previously created, create a new if block from Svelte. Now in the event component, let's handle the reset event. Whenever the reset event is fired, we set the input to an empty string. We also set the show reset message to true and we set a timeout for 1 second that sets the show reset message to false. Under everything, create a style element and apply some styles to the reset message class. If we go to the dev server, you can see that if we input some text into the text box and we reset it, you can see that an orange pop-up pops up under the input, and after 1 second, it disappears. You can see that it doesn't actually pop in and pop out, it actually fades in and out. This fade in and out effect is made possible by SvelteKit's fade function that we imported. Now go back to VS Code and comment out all of the code associated with the event component. Now, in the lib folder, create a new folder called style. Inside of this folder, create a new file called stylecomponent.svelte. Once you have the file open, create a new header. Under that, create a new paragraph with the class of new style. Under that, create a new paragraph with the class of conflicting style. And finally, create a new style element that applies some styles into the new style class. We're going to see how conflicting styles between the parent and the child components is resolved by Svelte. Now go back to the pluspage.svelte file and import the style component from the lib folder. In the HTML, use the style component. Let's make sure to fix the import. In the style tag, apply some styles into the conflicting style class. Under the style component, create a new paragraph with the class of conflicting style. As you can see, the parent has the same class for one of the paragraphs and the child has one of the same classes too. They both have the conflicting style class applied to them. Now go to the dev server, and as you can see, the main paragraph has its own orange style, the conflicting class in the child has no style applied to it, and the conflicting style in the parent has some styles applied to it which the child doesn't. Thank you for watching, and if you found this valuable, like and subscribe.